How would a culture react to zombies, the presence of bloodthirsty armies of vampires, or kaiju attacks? In a fantasy world, magical monsters, whether rare or common, are a reality. So it could be interesting to ponder how cultures would adjust to their presence. It can be tempting, of course, to turn any world filled with monsters into a grimdark, a nightmare realm with sorrowful peasants. However, it is worth remembering that a few years after Joan of Arc's village had been burned to the ground by marauding armies and raided on multiple occasions after disease had killed many of the people she loved, she described her village in idyllic terms and talked about how much she had loved working with her mother and other members of the village. This was during the height of the Hundred Years' War, an important time in shaping the culture and ideals of the French people. It is important to remember that the bright and often vibrant cultures we know today developed under some of the worst wars in history, the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands and the 30 Years' War in Germany, for example. Obviously, monsters and war are different, and how monsters would affect cultures is entirely speculative. There is no good research on the subject of how the presence of a dragon would impact the psychology and culture of a village, but there is a lot of research on how different catastrophes, from tsunamis to plagues and of course wars, will impact culture, which I will be using in my speculations for this video. Consider, for example, monsters such as vampires, werewolves, cultists, and demons that can change form or possess people. That is, monsters that could pretend to be ordinary people or even people you are friends with. As fairy tales show, people would have to be extremely careful with such monsters around. For example, one Romanian vampire tale begins: there once was a woman who fell in love with a young man who seemed perfect in every way. At last the two of them were married, and the woman went with the young man to his house. He led her into the kitchen, where he had a girl hanging from some meat hooks, for the man was a vampire. Even those one knew could become a threat in such a world, as is seen in the following story. Once upon a time, a boy and a girl loved each other, but the young man died and became a vampire. Though the girl didn't know this, that night, when she was alone in the house, the vampire came. But the vampires can only enter unclean homes. So, because the girl's home was clean, the vampire couldn't enter it. The vampire called up to the girl's window in his familiar and loving voice, and so lured her out into the night. Beyond the interesting fact that vampires could enter dirty homes and not clean homes, this story also reminds us that people had to be cautious not only with strangers, but with their friends. This is similar to the way people deal with pathogens, and so would likely impact a culture in similar ways. Research indicates that ethnocentrism and other specific forms of interpersonal prejudice and a strong disdain for deviation from social norms are strongly correlated with cultures that had to deal with a serious pathogen. After all, avoiding potential signs of pathogens and contact with outsiders is a good survival trait when a disease is ravaging the land. It's important to keep in mind that the presence of vampires doesn't mean people would be dark and brooding. Rather, they would be the opposite of the creature they are trying to avoid. If vampires are dark and brooding, people would go out of their way to be bright and vivacious, for the primary means of dealing with such creatures would be to watch out for signs that someone didn't fit the social norms, so the norms would be the reverse of the monster's instinct. Thus, in a world with werewolves hiding among people, meat might be eaten last, after long drawn-out sessions of eating tiny vegetable dishes, as a means of trying to get the hungry wolves to reveal themselves by obviously longing for or eating meat sooner than they should have. In a world with kitsune, who tend to act wild and speak rapidly, people would be more reserved, calmer, and controlled in hopes that the kitsune would lose control and reveal themselves. Generally, the cultural psychological response to mini monsters would be some form of collectivism, as collectivism is characterized by a strong value placed on tradition and conformity, whereas individualism is characterized by greater tolerance for and even encouragement of a deviation from the status quo. You can see, for example, the impact of pathogens on collectivist versus individualist behaviors in the graph. Of course, this chart isn't a perfect line because while pathogens are positively correlated with collectivism, they clearly aren't the only factor, which is why it's important to remember that there are many things that can impact a culture, and so the presence of one factor doesn't guarantee a culture will behave a certain way. This is because distrust of outsiders and a strong adherence to social norms aren't the only response to monsters. Indeed, we might see the opposite effect on a culture. For example, a culture which frequently has to deal with dragons, kaiju, or giants, or other massive monsters which could show up and destroy their village, could lead not only to greater levels of cooperation among the community, but also greater levels of cooperation with larger groups of people, sometimes in villages hundreds of miles away. That is, when the dragon attacked people might have to seek refugee, food, and aid in fighting the creature from other villages that are nothing like their own. As a result, people would need to befriend people from other lands, which would tend to make them more accepting of differences and more likely to get along with people outside their own in group, which is, of course, one of the hallmarks of individualism. Those living in cities and ports or who herd animals over long distances and are frequently in contact with peoples from many other lands will tend to be more individualist. In addition, the need for innovations can also help encourage individualism in a society. Thus, a place that needed inventive wizards or clerics would be more likely to shift individualistic. After all, individualistic values may promote other kinds of functional benefits. For example, the discovery or spread of beneficial new technologies may occur more frequently when individuals are encouraged to deviate from existing traditions and engage in interactions with non group members. In either case, disasters will generally tend to help enhance traditional means of seeking comfort or survival. Thus, we would expect those who must deal with monsters on a regular basis to have stronger tendencies towards aggression or caring, in-group social norms or out-group alliances, and so forth, depending on the nature of the monster involved. More than just psychological changes, the presence of monsters would likely be written into the very architecture of a village. Thus, in addition to walls, a city in a fantasy world could include the presence of frequent hardened canopies and gazebos with spikes atop them to stop wyverns or dragons from landing on or tearing their way through them. In addition, there could be vaults, similar to panic rooms, and tunnels throughout the village, and perhaps even under the fields where people farm, as a way of escaping flying or marauding enemies. In the fantasy realm of Ogmade, I wrote that every house has a few goats in it, so that if a giant rips the roof off, it is more likely to grab a panicking goat than a person holding a blade and who can quickly fling themselves down a trap door. It might even be that people would build multiple long, thin cities beside each other rather than one large city. That way, the sewage could flow from smaller pipes into larger sewers and storm drains that exist outside the city walls, in order to prevent sewer monsters from being an immediate threat. In other words, from the way people build their homes and towns, from the pets they keep to the way they think and feel could be impacted by the presence of monsters, and actually thinking about what these impacts might be could be very interesting for those seeking to create their world or simply wanting to muse on a fantasy world.